Good morning, this is Jim. Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank God. I apologize, folks. Been having some technical difficulties here this morning. Rima, did you open the meeting?
Nope, we will let you go ahead and get us started.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I do apologize. I'm still having some technical difficulties with my video, but I will continue to troubleshoot that. I want to welcome everyone to the State Autonomous Vehicle Work Group Executive Committee meeting. First, I'd like to acknowledge Darren Grendel's service as chair of the committee. We appreciate his service and wish him the best in the moving on to the private sector. As you know, I was vice chair for the committee, and I was asked to step up and serve as interim chair until the time that we can come together as a group and actually select a new chair. Right now, I'd like to go ahead and confirm that we have a quorum. So I would like Catherine to do a roll call of executive committee members.
Great, thanks, Jim. So we have on the call with us today, we have Senator Nguyen, Senator King, Rep. Kloba, Rep. Dye, Teresa Bernstein, Roger Millar, Charles Knutson, Allison Drake for Joel Sachs, Laura Johnson for John Wiesman, Jim Weaver, Pam Cook, Dr. Wang, Justin Lighton, Kurt Augustine, Brenda Wiest, Brian Mistel, John Milbrath, Bryce Yadden, Caleb Weaver, Steve Gordon, and Anna Zevarks. Did I miss anyone? If I did, and you could type it into the question, that would be great.
Okay, did we miss anyone from the exec committee? Catherine, did you see those in the question?
It doesn't.
Todd O'Brien from WSACE.
Got it.
Jack Lovell here for the insurance commissioner.
Great.
Okay, so I believe we have a quorum, so I'll go ahead and open this meeting, and I'll turn it over to Rima right now so we can explain the rest of the meeting today.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And this is, as we all know, a bit of an experiment as we work with all this software and virtual sharing of information. So hopefully this will continue to go smoothly. We are going to hear from the University of Washington's Law School today to report out on the national scan and review of regulations and laws across the country. And then we're going to hear from Bernard Soriano from the California Department of Motor Vehicles to share some information on the California Autonomous Vehicle Testing Program. We will hear from Scott Shogun for teeing up, I guess, if you will, a little bit of a discussion around direction and priorities going forward for the work group, just to kind of get everybody thinking and to prepare for maybe a future discussion at the June meeting around that. And then we'll open it up for discussion. Keep in mind after each presentation, if you're watching this online, you can type your questions in the chat box. In just a minute here, Era is going to walk you through how to do that. If you want to speak and ask your question, just simply type that in the chat box and we'll get you unmuted so you can talk. If you're calling in, if you're an executive committee member and calling in by phone only, Jim will ask after each presentation if there are any questions from you on the phone lines, and we will unmute at that moment so you guys can ask your question for those members that may be calling in. So with that, we will have that discussion at 11. We'll kind of open it up then for executive committee members and then close up.
Wonderful. Okay, so I guess we can move on. Markel, did you want to say something?
Yeah, actually, this is Era Swanson. I'm going to cover these next slides. Just a quick orientation. I think many of you have possibly used this platform or other similar platforms before, but we'll just cover, how to use this, especially during the question time. So we can go to the next slide. If you don't have it expanded already, there's a little orange arrow at the top. You might want to click that so it points to the left so that you can see your dashboard. When we get to the question time after each of the presentations, as well as the open forum at the end of the meeting, we'll ask that executive committee members use the chat and the question box to ask your question. Then Jim will call on you, and the organizers will unmute your audio. You'll also need to unmute yourself to do that. But you should also make sure that your camera is turned off, and for during the presentation that the audio button, which will either look like a microphone or a phone, is actually red with a slash through it. All right, we'll go to the next slide. I think this just is a screenshot of what that question box looks like. So that'll be what we'll want to use during the question time. We can go to the next slide. And if you are calling in, call-in participants do also have the option for doing that. Mute or unmute yourself by pressing *6 if you're calling in by phone only. And then when you're not speaking, just make sure that you are muted so that we don't pick up your background noise and so that we can hear the presenters and the other folks asking questions. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and introduce Bill Covington with the University of Washington Law School. Bill?
Okay. Am I unmuted?
You are, sir, and we can see you.
Oh, I don't know how good that is. First, thank you for allowing my students this opportunity to speak. My name is William Covington. I direct a public policy clinic at the University of Washington School of Law. My clinical law students spend a year looking at an issue where public policy and high tech converge. We've spent this year looking at various state policies on connected and autonomous vehicles, and we plan to continue to do this over the summer and in the incoming academic year. I would ask the committee to please understand my students have been working under considerably challenging circumstances. The UW Law School has had to quickly pivot from in-person learning to what my students now refer to as the Zoom University School of Law. So there have been some challenges we've been facing. With us today are Dylan Harlow, Emily Kawa Higashi, Janet Kang, Jake Reagan, Timothy Wolf, and Robin Lustig. Mr. Harlow will lead us off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. My name is Dylan Harlow. I'm the lead of the Connected and Autonomous Vehicles team here at the University of Washington. I just wanted to start us off today by introducing ourselves and talking a little bit about what we have been working on this past academic school year. Up on screen, there's a lovely little picture of us with Professor Covington, and I wanted to give a huge thanks to Ted Bailey for assisting us throughout the year. If we head to the next slide, I wanted to talk about a little bit about our goals with this project, and it's to provide the Washington Legislature with unbiased findings and analysis on the current state of autonomous vehicle legislation all across the country. And if we go to the next slide, how we've done this is we've made contact with all 50 states across the country. And as you can, sorry, next slide on there. There we go, perfect. As you can see, we've made contact with all 50 states across the country, and a majority of these contacts have been DOT and DMV representatives. A few states we've been in contact with state senators and House of Representative members, and then there's a couple states on there where we've made contact directly with the governor's office. This has proven particularly challenging, especially in light of this pandemic. Just reaching out to people, making time to contact them and have phone interviews with them has become more difficult as this pandemic has progressed. but we're doing our best to keep this information up to date and make contact as best we can. If we go to the next slide here, what we've been doing is when we've been reaching out to these different states is we've been collecting information in 13 different categories. And these categories range all the way from contact information to health and equity concerns that may arise as a result of autonomous vehicle and autonomous vehicle legislation. And there are some databases out there that categorize things like executive orders and legislation, such as the National Conference of State Legislatures database. And we hope to differentiate ourselves by adding on top of that information, as well as kind of a hallmark feature of our database being that we want to include the contact information of the people that we have been contacting throughout the country. And we hope to make this information public, put it online on UW's website by the end of the school year, so that others who are across the country who are interested in researching autonomous vehicles and the legislation behind them can use our database and find contact information to not only use our database to actually research and look at the different categories that we're researching in, but also use the contact information that we've collected to reach out to them, to states themselves, to kind of be on the cutting edge of where legislation is. If we head to the next slide here, just some examples of some of the questions that we've been asking. So for example, in testing, we're asking required information that the state requires from companies to certify for testing, the differing requirements for different types of vehicles within the state, and government investigations and auditing of self-driving car programs as it relates to certification. And then another big area that we've been emphasizing is definitions, and we've been really asking the representatives and the DMV officials that we've been reaching out to, where are the sources of these definitions coming from that end up in these pieces of legislation? And this often involves not only reaching out to the House of Representative member or the Congress or the senator that introduced the bill, but also finding sometimes the staff members and the lawyers that were behind the actual drafting of the language of the bill. And of course, that has been challenging, but we have been able to gather some significant data on that. And I will pass it over to Robin to start us off with the first portion of our presentation.
Thank you, Dylan. Once again, my name is Robin Lustig, and we wanted to include some data points on how perceptions of autonomous vehicles might change in light of COVID-19. Just before the outbreak hit the United States, AAA actually conducted a survey in January asking various questions to United States adults about their opinions on autonomous vehicles. The questions sought to determine where people stand on topics such as driver safety, liability, data privacy, and overall feel of bringing CAV technology into day-to-day life. The results of the survey showed that in general, Americans have either negative or actually neutral feelings about CAVs. We think it's important to note that 51% of surveyors reported interest in establishing laws to ensure that CAVs are safe. We think this certainly indicates that there is at least some interest in introducing CAVs into day-to-day life, pending further information and safety precautions are taken. We have reached out to our contact at AAA inquiring if they plan on doing a follow-up survey to see how coronavirus might shift their current data set, and at this time they have no intention of doing so, but they said they would let us know if they decide to conduct a follow-up survey, and we will, of course, post our findings. Nonetheless, we predict that the COVID-19 outbreak will change these perceptions, and if you would mind going to the next slide, please. Thank you. Ultimately, we predict that perceptions of CAVs will shift to a more positive direction. If not completely positive, we at least see a shift towards a more interested and people starting to seriously consider the possibility of CAV implementation. We think that CAV companies and interested stakeholders will start to carry out more testing and in turn begin to really push lawmakers to start to seriously finalize legislation for CAVs. This certainly could pose some risk, as CAV testing needs to be conducted carefully in order to minimize risk in practice and ensure that the proposed laws cover all aspects of potential issues. Furthermore, due to the fact that only 12% of surveyors reported that they would feel safe riding in a car that drives itself, we predict that CAV companies and projects will actually shift their focus to delivery-based services instead of person transportation. As you can see on the right side of the slide here, Mr. Grosbard, VP of Business Development for Tactile Mobility, which is an autonomous vehicle company, stated, "We don't want any human interaction. These types of services will be more and more in need." And another quote from Waymo's CEO states that removing the human driver holds great promise, not only for making our roads safer, but for helping our drivers stay healthy in these uncertain times. As I'm sure we can all relate, especially in light of reducing human-to-human contact and this new dedication we all have to staying home, autonomous delivery-based services could be more beneficial now than ever. Things like groceries, prescriptions, at-home testing kits could be delivered right to your door. And finally, we see an overall shift in the American perspective on autonomous vehicles, at least in line with these delivery-based services. We ultimately predict that people will start to have more trust in the services, which we think might open up the opportunity to implement human transportation in the future. We can even see an immediate future wherein people actually rely on these delivery-based CAV services. But this shift, of course, won't happen on its own. It won't happen overnight. The AAA survey told us that 49% of reporters are curious about data privacy in CAVs. 51% reported interest in laws to ensure safety, and 57% reported they would like to have a clear understanding of liability. Thus, this will require a drastic increase in public information in terms of testing, liability, data privacy, and more. If this data transparency is achieved, we can certainly see Americans changing their perspective on CAVs. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it back to Dylan.
Thanks, Robin. Perfect. And I just wanted to start my section off by talking a little bit, as I alluded to earlier, the ULC and kind of where states are getting their definitions from. And this has been a big area of emphasis for us when we're reaching out to these government officials. We're trying to figure out where they're getting the definitions when they define things like a dynamic driving task and a platoon. So generally, we're seeing states selectively pulling portions of the ULC model legislation and implementing them within their bills. And another option to that is that a lot of legislators we've contacted have said that the definitions and the languages in their language in their bill was lifted from other states or based on other states' legislation. And when we dig deeper into the language, actually comparing the words used in one state's piece of legislation to another state's piece of legislation, we often see that the ULC's original language comes out. And bills generally, more generally, bills that have been passed within the last few years tend to assemble task force, create definitions, and more recently have begun to set general requirements for testing, which we will get you later in this presentation. If we head to the next slide here, what we've made here is a breakdown of what we believe to be the ULC's definitions language usage across the country. And what we've done is we reached out to states and asked them, where have they gotten this language? And a lot of the time the answer we get is, we're not sure, we pulled it from another state, or we based it on the ULC legislation. And you can see the color breakdown there. The states in blue, we have found that legislation that they have passed has matched up pretty well to the ULC model legislation in terms of definitions. And again, this is just a definitions map, not a general legislation map. And in purple there, states that have told us that they've used another state's piece of legislation as a model. And then in green there, we have states that have explicitly told us that they have used the ULC as a basis for their model legislation. A couple states there patterned in to show that they have pending definitions bills on the books. We'll head to the next slide here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the ULC model legislation itself and kind of the positives and the areas that we think could be improved. So some of the positives, just it creates definitions so that everyone is on the same page across the industry, and that's kind of a theme that we like to see is uniformity. It allows companies to more easily comply all across the country with rules and regulations. It resolves the passenger licensing issue by making the legal operator of the vehicle the creator of the vehicle, and kind of in that same vein, it shields all non-driver passengers from liability, which is what we saw as a positive. Easily integrates into existing states' motor vehicle statutes. We think that's important because so much of what defines things like liability, accidents, who is responsible, is already built into states' common laws and state statutes, and a lot of that is going to apply when autonomous vehicles become more prevalent. Some of the improvement areas of the model legislation that we saw were that it doesn't necessarily explicitly preempt municipalities from regulating AVs, and we think that's important to keep that uniformity that we're looking for throughout legislation. It limits liability to only one party when multiple may be responsible, and what I mean by that is if a hardware manufacturer who is actually making the physical parts of the car were to sell that car to a company that then installs their software on it, and that car were to get in an accident and it was because of the software, it's possible that only the software company could be held liable or only the hardware manufacturer could be held liable, depending on how a state handles contributory or comparative negligence within their states, which we will get to a little bit later in this presentation. That third point, it doesn't address owner modifications, and it's kind of in that same idea of software modifications that an owner might hack into their autonomous vehicle and change the way it drives, or physically changing the autonomous vehicle in terms of the parts that it's made with. The last point I wanted to hit on is that the Act does not create definitions for level 1 or 2 vehicles, and it doesn't differentiate between level 1 and 2 vehicles and level 3 and higher. And we thought that was interesting because a bulk of the vehicles that are currently on the road that have autonomous features are either level 1 or level 2 vehicles. And I wanted to go to the next slide here and show just an example of what I'm talking about. And this is a portion of the Massachusetts bill that was recently passed. And in this bill, they included a definition for a level 3 vehicle. And I just want to read that bold portion, where the automated driving system performs all driving tasks and monitors the driving environment with the expectation that a human driver will be available to respond appropriately to a request to intervene. And we think this definition is sufficient, and we think it's important to include in pieces of legislation to make it really clear for people trying to follow the law, but also for courts, that this law is regulating only these levels of vehicles, and this is what defines what satisfies that level of vehicle. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Tim to talk about liability and insurance.
All right, thank you, Dylan. So existing liability law is made up of both statutory considerations and common law considerations. Statutory law being the law made by a state's legislature and then codified into the state's code. Common law created by the courts through judges' opinions. Most of these cases are going to be an interplay between product liability and negligence law. Product liability is where you're going to find the fault of the autonomous vehicle manufacturers, whereas then a plaintiff's damages will be determined by comparative or contributory depending on the state. Contributory liability essentially means that a plaintiff is barred from damages if they have been negligent in the situation themselves, whereas comparative negligence just reduces the plaintiff's damages by the amount of their own contribution to the accident. That happens to be the way that Washington works, we're a comparative negligence state. Some of the complications created by autonomous vehicles are that the statutory law, the way it was written, may conflict with the idea of software as a driver. And then, but on common law, on the other hand, should be flexible enough to address the complexities of these cases, although there are just a seemingly infinite number of scenarios that can occur. And I think it's important for states to keep their liability laws loose at this point and flexible, given the amount of scenarios that can happen. States are addressing it by, you see a lot of states including a different definition of what it means to be a driver for application into their motor vehicle code, and defining those terms for the application in the courts in case of a dispute. Next slide. I just wanted to show you here some of the breakdown of the negligence laws across the country. Because contributory negligence acts as such a bar for plaintiffs, I wanted to show you how fairly limited it is. It's only active in 4 different states. Like I said, Washington is a comparative negligence state, again, meaning the plaintiff's damages are just simply reduced by the amount of their own fault. A lot of other states have some sort of modified comparative negligence rules, meaning that there's either a 50 or 51% bar, depending on the state, that essentially a plaintiff needs to be less than 50 or 51% responsible for an accident to receive any damages at all, respectively. Next slide. Here I wanted to show you some of the additional insurance requirements that are being required across the country for testing of autonomous vehicles. A $5 million insurance coverage has sort of emerged as a trend, whereas other states are requiring $2 million, and then the blue states are states that require additional insurance requirements above existing insurance requirements, but below the $1 million sort of bar. Next slide. Right, so a $5 million umbrella and policy was obviously recommended by the Washington Autonomous Vehicle Work Group and passed into legislation earlier this year. Most states allow a bond in place of insurance requirements, which is something we have opted out of in this state. I'll get to that a little bit later. And then many states just have existing insurance requirements or have yet to act at all. Looking into the reasonableness of the $5 million policy, I was looking at numbers from the National Safety Council, and if a death does occur in one of these accidents, it can be upwards of $4 million, which tends to justify the $5 million figure. Something I haven't really seen in most states is different requirements for larger vehicles. Usually traditional insurance requirements do vary by the size and whether or not it's a commercial vehicle or not, whereas the additional insurance requirements have really yet to address that issue as far as I've seen. And then another consideration is consumer protection laws were written to protect a driver, owner, carrier, and not a passenger necessarily of the vehicle. So that's something that legislatures should think about as more and more claims come in from passengers of autonomous vehicles, and there's more protection needed for passengers as opposed to drivers of vehicles when collecting from insurance companies. Next slide. Talking with David Forte from Washington State Office of Insurance Commissioner about the $5 million proposal in Washington, they came to the conclusion that traditional coverage was reviewed and considered to be too low for emerging testing environments. I think that's fair. It's based on trends from other states, which you can see from the map that is true. The umbrella policy was the cheapest way to do this, as opposed to traditional liability coverage. It would only cost companies about $3,000 to $5,000 per year, which is reasonable. And there were concerns over access to a bond. If a company places a bond in place of the insurance company, in place of the insurance requirement, then the bond is a pool of money that can be depleted, whereas the insurance is going to pay out on a case-by-case basis. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Jake to talk about infrastructure.
Hey there. My name is Jake, and I'm going to be discussing the ways that states are adapting their infrastructure to accommodate CAVs, as well as the data privacy implications of the technology. Broadly speaking, we have identified 3 different types of infrastructure development associated with CAVs. However, as you can see from the slide, most states are still in the process of evaluating what steps to take, and are waiting to see how other states handle this issue. Part of our challenge is that a lot of the infrastructure being developed for CAVs is dual purpose, meaning that it can be difficult to determine whether a project is being undertaken specifically for CAVs or whether it is also general infrastructure development. Next slide, please. The first type of development that we've identified involves the creation of new infrastructure to allow for CAV development. CAVs rely on data to function, such as weather conditions, traffic patterns, etc. And each vehicle is estimated to require at least 25 gigabytes of data usage per hour. Consequently, states have found it necessary to develop infrastructure to allow for this data transfer while still on the road. This includes equipping certain roadways and traffic corridors with fiber optic cables, dedicated short-range communications technology, or DSRC, and 5G tech, which will which will facilitate communications between vehicles and the other relevant data sources. The second type of development that we have noticed involves the modification of existing infrastructure to be compatible with CAV technology. Most autonomous vehicles operate by the use of sensors to detect the location of other cars, traffic lanes, as well as lights and signs. As a result, some states are in the process of modifying road signs and lane striping to be more easily readable by CAV sensors. Finally, some states are also building new roadways and facilities specifically for the purpose of testing. This allows companies to test their experimental products without putting them on the road with actual passengers or needing to shut down general purpose roadways to allow the testing to take place. Next slide, please. Regarding data protection, our research suggests that states are generally not concerned with the data privacy implications of CAV technology at this time. While they are definitely aware of the concerns around this issue, most of the responses that we have received suggest that states are still in the process of considering what steps should be taken to address those concerns. Much of the conversation so far has been centered around exactly what data states should collect about testers and vehicles, rather than how that data should be protected. Now, every state with a testing program will require some form of registration, in which the companies conducting the testing must provide the state with some information about themselves, the specific individuals conducting the tests, as well as the nature of the tests being performed. Some states are also considering collecting more specific data from the vehicles themselves, such as the number of miles they've driven, the number of CAVs that are on the road, as well as information about crashes and other road safety incidents involving CAVs. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to the data collection practices of states themselves, CAV testers also have to navigate the laws which govern data privacy more generally. The United States has a patchwork system of data protection laws on both the state and the federal level, in which some laws apply to certain types of data, some laws apply to certain industries, and some laws protect specific individuals or types of individuals. Rather than go through all of these laws, I would like to focus on one particularly important law, the California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA. Now, the CCPA is the only statewide comprehensive privacy law in the nation, and as privacy protection becomes a more pressing issue, many states which are also seeking to enact comprehensive laws on the subject are looking to the CCPA as a model. The CCPA is an extraordinarily complicated subject, and we could spend a whole presentation just talking about the impact that it would have on the CAV industry. So instead, here are the highlights. The CCPA imposes data privacy obligations on for-profit businesses to protect the personal information of California consumers. The extent to which the CCPA will affect the CAV industry will first depend on exactly what data is being collected by the testing or deploying company. The definition of personal information provided in the statute is very broad, but it includes things like contact information, financial data, and most importantly, geolocation data, which will almost certainly have to be collected for the vehicles to function. Compliance with the CCPA would involve developing internal processes and procedures for handling the data subject rights established in the CCPA. These include the rights of consumers to access the data that a business has about them, have the data erased, transferred to them, or simply opt out of data collection entirely. The CCPA also requires that companies make certain disclosures in their privacy policy. Among other subjects, they must disclose the categories of PI that they are collecting, the sources that this PI will be collected from, as well as how consumers should submit the rights requests discussed earlier. Finally, companies of a certain size must appoint a data protection officer to manage their compliance efforts. The consequences of failing to comply with the CCPA could be steep. The CCPA is primarily enforced by the California Attorney General, who can bring suit for damages of up to $7,500 per violation. Furthermore, businesses who fail to adopt reasonable security measures to protect their data are subject to a private right of action in the event of a data breach. This is it for my section of the presentation, and I will turn it over to my colleague, Janet Kang.
Thank you, Jake. Hello, everyone, and I extend my apologies for the technical difficulties I had in getting my camera to connect. So my name is Janet, and I'll discuss what's currently happening regarding preemption of local and state regulations surrounding autonomous vehicles. So currently, there's still a range of uncertainties regarding preemption. What this slide is showing is that it shows any state that has provided answers regarding preemption, whether it's that there will not be local preemption or whether state alone will regulate autonomous vehicle regulations. So purple represents states that have decided that local regulations will be preempted, and green color shows states that have decided to give local government some leeway in creating their own regulations. So while it's too early at this stage to approximate where the states are headed, there seems to be a bit of a heavier trend towards preemption of local regulations. Next slide, please. Thank you. So currently there isn't federal preemption to the state autonomous vehicle regulations, possibly because they have not been brought into their full forms yet. But in March of this year, Congress considered enactment of House Bill 3388 that would have led to federal preemption to certain state regulations, but it was not enacted. This was not enacted because NADA suggested that states needed to retain their traditional roles in licensing and regulation of vehicle commerce. And to provide a couple of specific examples, Texas has already stated firmly that state alone will regulate autonomous vehicles and that cities may not pass their own regulations. And Nebraska and North Carolina also has determined that state law preempts local regulations. And then next slide, please. So there is an advantage of to adopting federal preemption. Corporate and autonomous vehicle industry prefers federal regulations with preemptive effect because it will lead to uniformity across the states. But there are several disadvantages to federal preemption. Each state and industry associations prefer to have its own regulations to preserve the state's traditional roles. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration suggested that there will be federal preemption in some areas, but not in others. So for instance, state regulations surrounding testing of autonomous vehicles as well as licensing will not be preempted, but there will be federal preemption surrounding safety standards and possibly state common law tort liability. An example of a city that's governed by its own local regulation is Boston, which allows autonomous vehicle companies to test in limited geographical areas during a limited circumstance, and its regulation is currently not preempted by state law. And they require companies to enter into memorandum of understanding covering certain specific issues around autonomous vehicle regulation. And I'll now pass it on to my colleague Emily, who will discuss the testing requirements.
Thank you, Janet. My name is Emily, and I will be talking about testing requirements for CAV companies. So there's a lot that can be covered regarding CAV testing, and I do want to note that there are some great presentations like the UC Davis presentation from earlier this year that cover things about legislation and pilot programs. So we decided to research and present on something a little different. Basically, the research that we decided to focus on was what testing requirements in each state are for CAV companies. So in other words, what hoops, if any, do companies need to jump through in order to test in that state? So through this research, we developed 4 categories. And the first category, as you can see on the table, is the no requirements category. And this is when there's either no legislation in the state about CAVs, or if there is any legislation, none of it mentions state oversight procedures. So in this situation, there might have only been legislation establishing a work committee or basic definitions. And Georgia is an example of a state with no requirements. The second category is called basic requirements, and this generally encompasses states which have passed minimal legislation or orders, and this often includes adherence to the traffic law, the presence of a human driver in most circumstances, and then some type of insurance requirements. However, even though these requirements exist, the state generally tends to take a hands-off approach. And we categorize Washington State as a state in this category because it has that more of a self-certification like process. So the third category is advanced requirements, and that means that the state is involved more with issuing permits, requiring some kind of reporting, and they often ask that testing be in collaboration with some state agency, and that's usually the state DOT. And then finally, we made a category for California because of how involved the government is in monitoring CAV testing. And I'll dive a little bit more into those requirements in a moment. Next slide, please. So this is our map with nationwide testing requirements per state. And one thing to note is that whether or not a state has more stringent requirements around testing is not necessarily conducive to whether a company will decide to test there. In fact, we've kind of seen that where pilot projects are based seems to depend more on whether there's a government interest. So for example, some state DOTs are the ones creating and managing pilot programs, or there might be a university interest. So if universities have tech majors, and some of them have built their own testing tracks and facilities, as well as the influence of where tech hotspots have been located throughout the country. Next slide, please. So in a way, there's kind of an open question as to how many state requirements is too many for testing companies. And California is actually a really good example of a state that's trying to find that line. So on this slide, you can see a comparison between California and Pennsylvania is a state with advanced requirements. And the big difference between the two is that California has a few additional fees, more reporting requirements, and they have different driver qualifications. So if you haven't seen it already, California has a 30-page CAV legislation, and drivers in that legislation cannot have been involved in the collision for which they were at fault. They're not allowed to have DUIs within the previous 10 years, and they must also complete an AV testing driver permit class, among other things. Furthermore, California requires an annual report with information on each vehicle and details about its testing. But most notably, California requires reporting of a disengagement requirement, and this means that companies have to report every time a vehicle turns off its CAV tech. And this disengagement reporting requirement has caused some ripples in the CAV community, with companies such as Waymo and Cruise giving feedback that the requirement isn't relevant to the success and quality of their technology. So just because of this feedback, I'm very curious to hear about Mr. Soriano's thoughts on whether a stronger government oversight has worked well for California. Next slide, please. So our last slide has some comments on some health and equity issues around CAV tech, and I've been able to attend the majority of the Health and Equity Subcommittee meetings, and I think the angle that the subcommittee is taking, which focuses on how CAV tech will affect our state specifically, is definitely on the right track. I've compiled a few Washington State transit issues that AVs could help with, as well as problems that may arise. So for example, just looking at that first bullet point, one of the major issues that the Seattle area faces right now is gentrification. So I think it would be really important to think about how AV tech might be able to reach neighborhoods that our bus and light rail cannot. And just broadly, incorporating current inequities in our transit system into our understanding of how CAV tech can provide access to marginalized communities will definitely help us identify how to structure and prioritize different policies and regulation. So thank you everyone for your time and for listening to our presentation, and then we'll move on to questions now.
Thank you so much, Emily. I have two questions right now. Oh, Tim, you're next.
We're all going to hop on and answer questions.
No, I was just, preparing for questions.
Gotcha. Okay, so first question that I had was from Barbara Moffett, and she wanted to know, what is the solid gray?
In which slide?
Does it say what slide?
Hey, Jim and everybody, this is Era. It was slide 16, and it was a map with a couple different colors, and there was one that was solid gray.
I think that's the insurance one, and Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but the solid gray means there's no additional insurance requirements specific to AVs?
Right. I really wanted to highlight the states that have specific requirements, and specifically in the $1 million range. The gray states are just states that have either not acted at all or are at this point are just requiring traditional insurance requirements.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Derek Vita, and it says, regarding liability, for a system where a car owner uses the internet or a mobile app to start a vehicle movement but not necessarily control it, example, Tesla's Smart Summon, who could be liable if the app fails to mid-maneuver and the uncontrolled vehicle causes a crash.
I'm sorry. I'm just trying to wrap my head exactly around the scenario. So the user is ordering the vehicle to move, and then the autonomous component goes into effect, and then an accident occurs.
That's how I understand it. Derek, did you want to weigh in? We may have to unmute Derek.
Right. I mean, to answer the question, I think as best I can. I mean, in Washington, which is a comparative fault, right? I mean, it's the autonomous vehicle manufacturer developer is going to be responsible for any fault in their system that causes the wreck. If it is found that a user ordered or operated the technology in some sort of negligent manner, then their damages are going to be reduced by the amount of their own negligence in that situation.
Hey everyone, Derek Vita here. Thanks for the input. So that helps answer my question a little bit. There's several sort of midway scenarios where a user will initiate a maneuver, and then the car will control movements on their own to a certain location. I was just curious what would happen if it's not necessarily a vehicle manufacturer system that fails, but let's say, for example, there's poor connectivity, like there's a problem at the cell tower level or something like that. I was wondering if anybody could comment on a scenario like that.
Right. So if it was essentially the connection failure that caused the wreck.
That's correct, or anything sort of that would happen in the middle of a maneuver like that.
Right. I mean, I think it would be difficult to parse out exactly who's responsible in that situation, but I do think that would fall on the manufacturer. They have to be writing their technology to work with, obviously, poor connectivity in certain situations.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Derek. Okay, moving on. I see that Secretary Millar has a question, so if you could unmute him and allow him to speak.
Thanks, Jim. This is Roger. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir, we can.
Great, thanks. Great presentation, everybody. I really appreciate it. I was curious on the national narrative. The survey that AAA conducted is pretty skeptical on acceptance, and then you pivoted to, and now with COVID, everybody's going to love it. And the quotes were all people who have a vested interest in everybody loving it. I'm just curious about how, you know, the survey was pretty broad. I would like to see the thought about the post-pandemic be broad as well. What we've seen at WashDOT with our monitoring of travel around the state, the only form of travel that's actually gone up during the pandemic is people walking and people bicycling. There are a lot of people who have a lot of different opinions about what the post-pandemic world is going to be like, and would love to have that broader perspective considered, like it was considered by AAA in the pre-pandemic survey that was done. So as you go forward, it would be great to maybe broaden the scope of the people you ask the question of.
Certainly.
Thank you, sir.
I just want to ensure that I understand what you are asking. And first of all, I would like to clarify, perhaps I misspoke earlier, but we don't necessarily see that all adults everywhere will flip-flop immediately. These are just predictions that we have based on the current national narrative. So if I misspoke, I apologize. But we definitely want to take into consideration a broader perspective moving forward, especially if we were to conduct a secondary survey. And in contacting AAA, we'll be sure to include that as well.
Yeah, and I didn't think that, this is Roger again, I didn't think that you misspoke. I thought it was great. It's just that sometimes we find ourselves in an echo chamber, you know, all of us that are kind of in this world. And I think it would be beneficial, you know, particularly as there are policymakers involved in these calls, to understand that, yeah, that's an echo chamber. People in the connected autonomous vehicle world are looking for any opportunity to advance their technology, and that's fine. I mean, I have no problem with that at all. But we do need to understand that there are other voices out there, and it's just important to include them in the conversation as well. So thanks for what you're doing, and I look forward to seeing even more and better. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Next question we have is from John Niles. Question for legal presenters. Please discuss the current legal status in Washington State of the fully deployed Tesla autopilot technology, which allows a Tesla operator to drive for many miles along I-5 with her hands in her lap. Tesla vehicles nationwide have been involved in several fatal accidents where the role of the autopilot versus the human operator is not clear. Discuss the legal issues that arise. I personally know Tesla drivers in this state who operate under autopilot who do not understand its limits.
Professor, did you want to speak on this?
Who now?
Professor Tim? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, in the case of the situation where you have sort of a hybrid of human engagement and autonomous vehicle technology, right? It's going to be difficult to parse who exactly was responsible in those situations. I don't deny that assigning liability or assigning fault is going to be difficult. But, you know, I think with the amount of data that you're able to collect with these autonomous vehicles, you have a pretty good idea of what happened in that moment, right? So to what extent it was the person's fault and to what extent it was the vehicle's fault. And it differs significantly based on the level of autonomy, right? I mean, if you have autonomous technology that's completely in control of the car, that's, you know, one end of the spectrum where it's fairly easy to assign liability to the autonomous vehicle manufacturer. If you have a traditional car which is completely operated by an individual, it's fairly easy. Obviously, there's a lot of gray area in between, and it can be very difficult. But as far as assigning liability, it is going to be up to a court to determine the amount of fault in that situation based on, and that can include if you're operating a vehicle that you are responsible as an individual to be able to take over and you're not ready to take over, then that is you acting negligent in that situation. Does that make sense? So it's going to be an interplay of product liability and negligence law, and it's going to be a very case-by-case basis, and it's also going to vary significantly on the level of autonomy. And that's why I think it's so important that you remain flexible as you're thinking about crafting any kind of liability legislation, because there's just such a wealth of different scenarios that can come up. And I mean, in the last 100 years of vehicles being on the road, we've seen almost every combination of liability from a poorly designed or malfunctioning part in combination with somebody operating drunk at the wheel and everything in between. And it is on a case-by-case basis the amount that the person should have been responsible for the vehicle in that moment versus how much the autonomous technology should have been responsible in that moment. I'm sorry if that's not a great answer, but it is really a case-by-case basis, and it depends on a number of factors.
Thank you, Tim. I think we're going to move on, folks. We have limited time, so I'll remind executive committee members that if you do want to speak, you need to type it in the question box, and then we'll call on you. But we'll have to unmute you first. Okay, I'm going to move on to. Oh, is there someone else? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and.
Jim, this is Rima. I believe Representative Dye had a question real quick.
Yes, Representative Dye.
Hi, this is my first meeting, so I apologize, but you talked about the definitions of what a passenger is versus a driver in the liability part. And I was wondering if there is anybody that defined it as the person riding in the AV is always the passenger and the software is the driver, or is that like the person who operates the interface to initiate the AV features, that would be the driver?
So,
I think I've given a lot of thought about this and how states are defining driver, and rather than it being, you know, the driver is always the autonomous vehicle technology or it's always the user, I think the law should be written that it's whatever entity or person is in control of the vehicle in that moment, right? Or a combination of the two.
I think that you were referring to the slide that was talking about how it resolves passenger licensing and non-driver passengers. So I think that what we were talking about in the ULC model legislation is that it assigns one entity or one person or one group the responsibility of driver, much like it is today in current law where one person is driving a vehicle. So they've kind of adapted that idea so that the liability is a little bit easier to sort out in court. And have basically is assigning the driver to either the software or if the company is making the hardware and the software. But that's kind of up in the air whether or not there's multiple drivers that are responsible. But in terms of the ULC, it defines one entity as the driver.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate your question and answers. We're kind of behind, folks, so we're going to move on. If you had a question and didn't get it answered, we will make sure to follow up with you and get your question answered. I'd like to move on now because we have California's Autonomous Vehicle Testing Program up next, and I'll introduce Bernard Soriano, the Deputy Director for California Department of Motor Vehicles. Bernard, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for having me participate in this work group. Thank you, Rima, for the invitation. I'm happy to share the activities that are going on in California. So as was mentioned, I'm Bernard Soriano. I'm the Deputy Director at the California Department of Motor Vehicles, and I'm in charge of the autonomous vehicle regulations in our state. What I wanted to do today was kind of give you all an overview of the AV landscape in California, talk a little bit about the regulatory structure, go through the history of what we've done and why we've done it, and more importantly, how we've done it. And then also be happy to answer any questions that you all have at the end. We've been on this journey for a number of years now. It started way back in 2012 when legislation was passed that put the onus on the Department of Motor Vehicles to allow autonomous vehicles on California's public roadways. And this was the first time that regulations were being developed around vehicles that have some sort of autonomy where the driver can be disengaged. And we've done regulations quite a bit, but this was the first time that California took on regulations around the vehicle itself. And typically this is something that is done at the national level through USDOT and more specifically NHTSA. So what we did was, this was back in 2013, we formed our own working group, our own autonomous vehicle working group to help with the development of those regulations. And we involved a number of different entities. First of all, our state partners, the law enforcement arm, so our California Highway Patrol, the owner infrastructure, or infrastructure owner, Caltrans, our Office of Traffic Safety, as well as our overall transportation agency and our Department of Insurance. We felt those state entities all had a stake in what the autonomous vehicle regulations would have. And more importantly, we decided to also include our federal partners with NHTSA. So working together, we all had several meetings to discuss what would be appropriate to have in our regulations. And then we also involved the industry, both the manufacturers, the OEMs, the tier 1 suppliers, as well as other institutions such as academic institutions and other researchers. Had a series of working group meetings as well as workshops to gather input and develop those regulations. What we came up with were a set of regulations that were staggered. We initially came up with a set of regulations around testing autonomous vehicles, and then later we came up with a set of regulations around the deployment of autonomous vehicles, and I'll speak to all of those. Emily kind of gave a preview of what those regulations entail, and I'll speak to those next. So next slide. So our testing regulations took effect in September of 2014. And what we came up with were a number of guidelines that manufacturers need to meet in order to test their vehicles on our public roadways. First, we said that the manufacturers themselves need to demonstrate an ability to respond to a judgment of at least $5 million. And they do that through either an insurance policy or a bond or be self-insured. We also said that in order for these companies to test their vehicles on our roadways, they need to have a safety driver on board, and that safety driver needs to be seated in what is traditionally known as the driver's seat. So we recognize that some companies are developing vehicles that don't have the traditional cockpit, nor would they have the traditional controls. But we said for this initial go around, they need to have controls in the vehicle, and those test drivers need to have access to those controls. In addition, those drivers need to be classified as good drivers. They need to demonstrate the ability to be able to control that vehicle if needed. So the good driver definition was something that we relied on. The driver cannot be at fault in any crash in the past 3 years. They can't have more than 1 point on their record in the past 3 years, and they can't be convicted of a DUI in the past 10 years. In addition, the companies themselves need to have a driver training program that's commensurate with the technology that they've developed. And those drivers all need to complete that driver training program. And then lastly, the people that are in the vehicle that would be drivers, they have to be an employee or a contractor or somebody designated by the company to perform that function. What we did not want to have in California was members of the public be used as guinea pigs in the vehicles in the course of testing. So those are some of the requirements that the companies need to have in order to receive a valid testing permit. The permit was valid for a year. We've since modified the regulations to have the permit be valid for 2 years. The vehicles themselves that fall under these regulations would be vehicles that would be classified as a SAE level 3 and above. And we realize that level 2 vehicles are on the roadways now. Tesla's Autopilot, for instance, and others were already on the roadways, and our regulations were covering vehicles that were the next step, which would be, like I mentioned, the level 3 and above. Vehicles that are excluded from our regulations were commercial vehicles, as well as vehicles that were over 10,000 pounds gross vehicle weight rating. So no heavy-duty vehicles to be operated autonomously on our roadways. And then in the course of testing, the manufacturers needed to abide by a couple things related to data sharing. One is reporting any collisions that have occurred, and the reporting would be of all of the details, where it occurred, who was involved in it, and what were the circumstances. So we have all of those collision reports. And then on an annual basis, the reporting of something we call the disengagement report. And this disengagement is whenever the technology either failed or the safety driver felt they needed to disengage the technology and take over for whatever reason. And we require these companies to develop these reports, submit them to us annually. And the purpose, I'll speak a little bit to the purpose of the report, because Emily mentioned it earlier, was the purpose was for us to at least get a window into how these companies are developing the technology and whether or not the technology has advanced over time. It was never meant to compare one company to another. Nonetheless, the industry itself is they hold their data very close to the vest, and so any type of data that's available gets scrutinized quite a bit. So we've had several reporters look at the data because we make this available online and write articles about the technology that one company is developing versus another and make comparisons. And I have to always stress that that was never the purpose of these disengagement reports. I mentioned as we developed the regulations, we had several workshops. We had the involvement. We invited the public to participate, and we invited the industry to participate. And throughout those workshops, the question of data sharing and the question of a measure of how the technology has developed always came up. And we were pressing to see what would be appropriate for reporting. What was that balance? And these disengagement reports are what was the outcome of that. Here we are, a number of years later, and industry is questioning whether or not those disengagement reports are of any value. And our response was those disengagement reports were the result of input from industry. And we would be more than happy to consider other types of reports. Just tell us what would be appropriate or what would be an appropriate type of data reporting that would speak to something that would be of more value. So we're all ears. We would be happy to entertain anything else that would be that could be used. And so it's a little unfair for industry to be able to say that these reports are of no value without offering any other type of alternative. Next slide. So the companies that are approved for testing, these are just some of the logos that are of the companies that are currently approved for testing. We have approved 71 companies. Next slide. And these are those 71 companies that are currently approved for testing in California. You'll see it's a mixture of the traditional OEMs, the tier one suppliers, technology companies, a number of small startup companies in the Bay Area. We got a full gamut of companies that are testing throughout our state, mainly in the Bay Area, but the permits that they have allow them to test anywhere in our state, and so they're testing throughout. But like I mentioned, the majority of them are concentrated in the Bay Area. Of the 71 companies, there are a few of them that have let their permit lapse. and they have their, you'll see them on this chart with the line out. And they've elapsed for a couple of reasons. One was either a company has decided not to continue testing or to not be in this space, or they merged with other companies. An interesting one to note would be autonomous vehicle permit number 26. That would be UATC or Uber. They had let their permit lapse soon after that unfortunate crash in Arizona with the fatality, and they let their permit lapse, so they ceased testing. And recently they reapplied for a permit and were granted a permit to continue their testing again. And so they're approved to continue to test in California. Next slide. So all of these companies report to us as part of getting their permit who their test drivers are, so we can check their test drivers, as well as identify all of the vehicles that they have in their test driver program. So of those 71 companies, 65 are active, and we've got over 3,000 test drivers and just under 900 vehicles at this point that are being tested throughout. As far as the collisions are concerned, next slide. We've had 256 crashes as of the end of last month. And you can see the majority of them are with Cruise and Waymo and Zoox. It's to be expected because the distribution of those 883 vehicles, a large portion of them are with Cruise and followed by Waymo. So it reasons that they would have the majority of the crashes. By and large, almost all of these 256 crashes have been very, very minor. The typical scenario that happens is the autonomous vehicle approaches an intersection, and that intersection is controlled with a traffic light, and the traffic light is red. And so the autonomous vehicle comes to a complete stop before making a right turn. And in the process of coming to a complete stop, it gets hit from behind by a conventionally driven vehicle. Because those conventionally driven vehicles, by us, by humans, we're not used to people coming to a complete stop before making a right turn. Or we're not used to vehicles slowing down at a yellow light, getting ready to stop. And so we're seeing these collisions at very low speeds, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5 miles an hour, and very, very minor damage, if anything. There have been a few crashes, however, that have been more severe. The most notable one was about 4 years ago, and it involved a Waymo vehicle, where the Waymo vehicle collided with a articulated city bus, and in that instance, it was the software that determined there was enough room for the vehicle to be in the same lane as the bus, and a collision occurred. And Waymo has since changed their software to so that does not occur again. Next slide. Here's a graph of where all of those collisions are occurring, and as you can see, most of them are in San Francisco, where Cruise is doing a lot of their testing, as well as down in the South Bay in Silicon Valley, where many of these others are doing their testing as well. So that's our testing program. We have also provided Our regulations also have provided for the next step besides testing with a test driver, and that is testing without a safety driver on board. And those regulations took effect in 2018. To date, there have been 2 companies that have been approved for that type of testing, and that is Waymo, as well as another company that is looking at the delivery of vehicles or goods delivery, and we've recently gone ahead and issued those permits. However, no driverless testing has taken place yet because those permits are still very new, and the companies themselves have not started to actually do the testing on the roadways. The requirements for them to go ahead and do those testing were quite involved. In addition to what we had already put in place with the $5 million, the companies themselves to move forward with driverless testing needed to develop something called a law enforcement interaction plan. And that is a how-to guide for law enforcement to be able to interact with a vehicle that has no humans on board. And it's a plan that speaks to some very tactical things, such as how to extract people from the vehicle, how to ensure that the vehicle doesn't drive off, how to identify the vehicle, where are the cables that need to be cut in order to ensure that the vehicle is disabled, things of that nature. So as I mentioned, 2 companies have been approved, Waymo and Nuro, and they have developed their law enforcement interaction plan. Our California Highway Patrol was involved in reviewing those plans. And in addition, the companies needed to notify the local authorities on where they plan on testing about their plans for conducting completely driverless testing. And those local authorities needed to just acknowledge the fact that the companies would be doing that sort of testing. As I mentioned, the 2 companies have the permits now, but they haven't actually tested without a driver. Next slide. So our regulations really needed to mirror and to be developed in a way that is copacetic with what the federal government is doing, and they really focus on the state's roles with regard to automobiles. The feds are responsible for the safety of the occupants of the vehicle, and they do that through motor vehicle safety standards, and states are responsible for the safe operation of the vehicles. And we do that through licensing of drivers. And with autonomous vehicles, that line is blurred. But we really try and have our regulations be able to speak to the safe operation of the vehicle, and really rely on the feds to be able to speak to the safety of the occupants of the vehicle. And we really look at having the manufacturers be the ones to self-certify to the safety of their products, which is in line with what the scheme is in the United States, without having a third-party type approval before the sale of vehicles. Next slide. So these are just some of the images of the different vehicles that are either being tested or are being considered in California. These are the ones that are on the slide now are vehicles that are being used for the delivery of people or the delivery of goods. And typically they're low-speed vehicles that are being used in that capacity. Next slide. And then we've got other vehicles that are coming forth that we have to deal with and are looking at how we're going to deal with it. On the bottom left is Neuro's vehicle. Now they have a permit, but on the upper left and right, as well as on the lower right, are vehicles that, or are, I should say, devices that are being used that we still need to be able to determine how and if we're going to handle. These are vehicles that are very small and being operated on sidewalks to do goods delivery. It's an area that sort of falls is not covered under our vehicle code, and we need to be looking at that. Next slide. The next area too that we are looking at are these things that are basically remotely operated vehicles. So there are companies in California, Phantom Auto, for instance, which are operating vehicles with a driver that is not seated in the vehicle. These are not autonomous vehicles. These are remotely controlled vehicles. So lots of questions about how these, should be dealt with, because lots of different questions about the driver and the responsibility of the driver, where the driver is located, what the driver can and cannot do, or should not do while they are operating the vehicle on the roadways. Next slide. Then I wanted to just kind of speak to the relationship that California has with the federal government. And it started, like I said, back in 2013 when we worked very closely with NHTSA, and we enjoy a very close relationship with NHTSA, where we worked with them as they developed their initial automated vehicle policy, and then also when they developed their first 2.0 document, which has been updated several times. We were heavily involved in the development of the model state policy, which is outlined in that first document. And then lastly, I wanted to speak to, next slide, I wanted to speak to California's involvement both internationally as well as through several working groups. As autonomous vehicles were being developed throughout a few years ago, NHTSA recognized that there was a potential of a patchwork of different regulations throughout the country, and in response to that, they provided some initial funding to the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators to develop a working group to minimize this risk of a patchwork of regulations. And so a working group was formed, and it was made up of a number of different states as well as Canadian provinces. And NHTSA was involved in that working group. California is the chair of the working group, and Michigan's the vice chair. So I'm the chair of that working group. My counterpart in Michigan is the vice chair. And as I mentioned, we've got a number of different entities, that states and provinces that are involved. And we've worked to develop a set of jurisdictional guidelines for states to follow should they decide to administer autonomous vehicles. And we really needed to thread the needle and balance the different philosophies in all of the states, philosophies around regulation. You know, some states are regulation heavy, others are regulation light, and by having the involvement of all of these different states, we were able to develop the document, which speaks to some of the best practices that states should follow, and these are recommendations, but best practices that states should follow should they decide to move forward with AVs. Interesting to note that a number of different international governments outside of Canada were very interested in this document, as well as other entities, including the Uniform Laws Commission. So as the ULC developed their document, they were involved with our working group. And the ULC developed their documents much later, after states had already moved forward with different regulations as well as legislation around autonomous vehicles. So that's a quick overview of California's involvement, and I wanted to just leave you with this before taking questions. You know, it's hard. It's not regulating autonomous vehicles isn't easy. It's something that is complicated and something that is challenging, and it it really hit me in a funny way. I get this. I have the opportunity to speak to different schools and kind of talk to kids about, you know, what they should do as they move forward with their education. And I was speaking at a middle school that had a STEM day, and I wanted to really stress, because I'm an engineer and I love engineering, I really wanted to stress to the kids the importance of studying math or engineering or science. Next slide. And I get these thank you notes, and this thank you note from this sixth grader came along, and I read it, and I laughed out loud because it really hit home about how difficult this is, and I'll read it to you. Dear Bernard, thank you so much for coming to our middle school's college career day and talking about your career. Something I learned from you is what you have to do to become an engineer. One thing that impressed me about your career is how you work on self-driving cars. Because of your presentation, I've decided to become a lawyer. I appreciate you coming. Sincerely, Alejandro. So apologies to all of the lawyers on this call, but it kind of speaks to, you know, how difficult this is. It's not about the technology, it's about everything else. Next slide. That's my contact info. I'd be happy to answer any questions you all have. Please feel free to either shoot me an email, give me a call, or send me something on Twitter or LinkedIn. So I'll pause now and see if there's any questions, and hopefully I'm able to answer them.
Yep, we have a few of them for you, Bernard. Thank you so much for your presentation. The first one comes from Drew Wilder, and it's, why were commercial vehicles excluded?
Oh, good question. We had a robust discussion about that, and initially it was because, and again, keep in mind, we started this back in 2013. And it was decided that from a public perception standpoint, we didn't want the public's view of autonomous vehicles the first view of autonomous vehicles to be a fully laden 80,000-pound semi-truck that potentially wouldn't have a driver on board. And we felt that commercial vehicles was not something we wanted to deal with at that time, and it was easier to deal with passenger vehicles or conventional vehicles as opposed to heavy-duty vehicles. We've since learned that commercial vehicles with regard to, or I should say autonomous technologies with regard to commercial vehicles were taking on were being developed for vehicles that were, say, less than 10,000 pounds. And so we've since modified our regulations to allow commercial vehicles under 10,000 pounds. But heavy-duty commercial vehicles over 10,000 pounds are still not allowed on our roadways.
Thank you, Bernard. Next, we have a question from an executive committee member, Anna Zavarts. Anna, did you want us to unmute and you could speak to your question?
Sure. Let's see, I'm unmuted. Great. Yeah, this is Anna Zavarts. I'm from Disability Rights Washington. And I wanted to ask a little bit more about the lighter weight, slower speed delivery robots. And if you are working on regulation of those, it seems like from my understanding that we may see more deployment of those sorts of autonomous vehicles sooner, just because the risks are in some ways less. Not saying they're not there. And I think for the disability community in particular, on sidewalks and with blocking access to crosswalks or to get onto crosswalks from the street, as we've seen in some cases, there is some real concern. So I'm just curious if you could speak a little bit more about some of those smaller vehicles.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, those the vehicles that are under 10,000 pounds being used for commercial or commercial vehicles under 10,000 pounds were initially not allowed on our roadways. But we have since modified our regulations to allow those vehicles to be on our roadways. And so those companies themselves are allowed for testing purposes to be used, as well as a structure in place for companies to apply to us for a deployment permit, so they can do this commercially outside of testing. And so yes, those companies have the ability to be able to deliver goods, to be able to move people. Now the movement of people also involves another governmental entity, the Public Utilities Commission. But with regard to where the DMV sits, we provide the permit to allow them to operate their vehicles on the roadways. So companies like Neuro and others have the ability to be able to deliver goods, and if they do it within a testing regime, it would be without compensation. If they want compensation, then they would apply to us for a deployment permit. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, do you feel, or from what you've seen with the permits and the direction things are moving in California, that should be a larger piece of our focus about talking about some of the issues that some of these, slower and lighter and even, sidewalk using AVs bring up versus the sort of traditional car model?
Yeah, it's, from what we've seen initially, what we saw was a focus on vehicles themselves or people's vehicles, right? So personally owned vehicles where people, don't want to deal with driving in stop and go traffic, and so they engage the autonomous technology. It seems like the market has shifted to more of a focus on this low speed goods delivery, and with that low speed vehicle being a lower risk, if you will, vehicle, it seems like that is something that may be coming to market sooner rather than those than a vehicle that would be used in a fleet environment. Doesn't mean that it needs to be one or the other. Both are probably going to be, and I hate looking into a crystal ball, but I would say both are probably going to be developed at the same rate. But it certainly seems like the risk tolerance for a lower speed vehicle is where if it gets in a crash, the only thing that gets hurt is a bag of oranges as opposed to a person, has some advantage. Those vehicles that are, or those things that are traversing the sidewalks, probably, at least for us, probably has to have a deeper look into the vehicle code to see how to deal with them. So that is a little bigger lift.
Thank you, Bernard. I have a question from Representative Shelley Kloba. Representative Kloba, do you want us to unmute you, or do you want me to just ask your question?
Unmuting me is fine.
Thank you.
Sorry. Of course, the minute I step away. So, in terms of allowing the manufacturer to certify that the AV has been tested and under controlled conditions and it's safe to operate, what kind of metrics are you using? Is it just them saying, yeah, it's safe, or are there certain criteria that have to be met? Is there, I just wanted a little more detail on what you consider safe and how you arrive at that conclusion.
Yeah, good question. We really had to, and this is where we really worked with our federal partners, because as you know, in the United States, it's a self-certification model. And by that, I mean the manufacturers self-certify that their vehicles meet federal motor vehicle safety standards before selling it. And those federal motor vehicle standards speak to the safety of that vehicle. And so that self-certification model is something that we carried throughout our regulations. So yes, the manufacturers self-certify that their vehicles are safe to operate on our roadways. The difficulty is that there are no federal motor vehicle safety standards around autonomous technologies at this time. And so the manufacturers themselves are self-certifying that their products are safe, but then there's no standard to look at to determine what safety is. During the development of our regulations, there was discussion about whether or not there needed to be a structure for some sort of third-party certification of those vehicles before they get let on our roadways. And in those workshops, we heard it from the manufacturers, from industry, and others about how that is not how it's done in the United States. That's how it's done in Europe and elsewhere where there's a type approval, but not in the United States. And so it was decided we're going to have a structure in place in California that still does this self-certification model. So yeah, in our regulations, in order to receive a permit, the manufacturers need to certify that their products have been tested under controlled conditions and are safe to operate on the roadways. So if something does happen, it's on them.
Thank you, Bernard. The next question we have is from Dr. Yin-Hai Wang, the director of the STAR Lab at the University of Washington. Dr. Yang, you're unmuted.
Okay, hello everyone. So my question is, how many of the AV involved crashes are actually the AVs at fault?
Yeah, so I get that question a lot. So we do not assess fault on those crashes. We simply collect the data. That being said, we make that data available so you can see yourself all of those 256 crashes. They're posted on our website. it's fairly easy to ascertain that the vast majority of those are not the fault of the autonomous technology. The one I mentioned about the Waymo vehicle colliding with the bus, clearly that was the autonomous technology. But also keep in mind that some of these crashes are, or I should say, some of these incidents are not reported, and these would be near crashes or near misses, or something that is reported were crashes that occurred as follows. And this did happen. This is one of those reports that you'll see, and there are a few instances like this where the safety driver disengaged because they felt the autonomous technology was behaving in a way that it shouldn't be behaving, and as a result of disengaging, there was a crash. So I'll describe it. So the one that I'm speaking of in particular, an autonomous vehicle was traversing the road or was going on this roadway, and there was another street that was perpendicular, and the autonomous vehicle sensed a second vehicle on that perpendicular street traveling at a high rate of speed, and it was traveling. The software determined that vehicle was traveling at too high of a speed to be able to stop before entering the roadway. And so the autonomous technology started slowing down the vehicle. The test driver didn't see the other vehicle, and the test driver felt the autonomous vehicle slowing down. So she disengaged the autonomous technology and sped up and took over manual control and sped up. And in doing so, went into the path of the other vehicle that was going too fast. And so a collision occurred. So the question is whether or not that collision would have been avoided if the technology would have remained engaged. You know, when they run it through when the companies run it through their simulation, they say, yeah, it would have been avoided. But you know what actually happened was there was a collision that occurred. So we don't assess the blame, but you can see how many of those crashes occurred, and then you can make that determination yourself from those reports.
Thank you very much. So can I say the AV behavior and the human behavior difference is a major contributing factor to the crashes?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so I mean, like the conventional driver's expectation of behavior is different from the autonomous vehicle behavior. It looks like you mentioned that at the signalized intersection, the AV make a complete stop before making a right turn, but normally human drivers won't. So is this kind of behavior expectation a major factor for AV involved crashes?
Yeah, that seems to be a causal factor for the crashes. And again, the sample size is small, right? There's only 256 of these crashes, but we're seeing the vast majority of them are they seem to be, or a factor that seems to come into play in these crashes is the conventional driver behavior. We're just not used to people driving correctly, right? We're used to people driving in ways that humans drive, and the way humans drive, we don't follow the law. We enter an intersection, a signalized intersection, before making a left turn. We don't wait behind the line until it's clear, and then we enter that intersection. And we speed up at yellow lights. We don't come to a complete stop. And so when those things actually occur, people are hitting those vehicles.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, so that also speaks to the need for a public education component in order for the technology to be readily accepted or for the technology to be effectively deployed within society. And who does that public education is, to be determined. Is that government's role? Is that industry's role? Is it the manufacturer's role for their particular technology? I'd like to think it's a shared responsibility. I'd like to think people are always following the law, but then that would be it's not reality. As companies develop the products, there's a component there where companies' products need to be developed in a way that the public knows how to use the technology and is it's something that is safe to use.
Yeah, I simply agree. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Bernard, and thank you for the question. The next question comes from Laura Johnson, who's representing Secretary of Health John Wiseman's office. Laura, you're unmuted.
Sorry for the delay. And I think it's okay to hold off on my question. I know we're short on time.
Oh, okay. No problem.
I'd be happy to take your question if you want to email it to me.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We do have a number of questions here, and we're not going to get to all of them. So please do make sure we will make sure that we respond to you and get you your answers. The next question we have is from Andrew Dannenberg. Andrew, you should be able to speak.
Yeah. Hi, I just want any comments on how often a safety driver had to intervene to prevent a crash?
We look at those disengagement reports and we do some data analytics on it. I don't have the number offhand now. Some of those disengagements for the various companies have been low, somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple hundred. There have been some companies that have developed a report, an annual report that would have over 70,000 disengagements. So now, how many of those were the result of a test driver gaining control versus the technology telling the driver, "Look, you got to take over"? I just don't have that breakdown right now.
Okay,
I can get it for you though if you want it.
No, if it's convenient, but not critical.
Okay.
We have 2 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and speak for a few questions here. So one was from Scott Machines. Does California user data collected from AVs for the purpose of tracking or monitoring road usage and or road improvement needs like pothole tracking?
We do not use the data for that purpose. We have had requests from several transportation agencies, most notably the local transportation agencies, but we don't collect data that would really speak to that.
Okay. Next question is from Kevin Tobiad, and it's, does California AV vehicles designated in any other way with a sticker or other symbol?
No, we had, again, that was another robust discussion we had as we developed the regulations. Some people felt that there should be a designation on the vehicle. In the end, it was decided not to require that. The law enforcement in particular was concerned that if a vehicle was identified as a autonomous vehicle, that the general public could use could view that as sort of a target. Waymo has deep pockets, and so some sort of collision with the vehicle could result in something that would, let's just leave it at that. So it was decided not to require the identification of the vehicles. That being said, the manufacturers themselves can plaster their logo all over the vehicle if they want to.
Understand. Okay, thank you. We've run out of time for questions. We will get your answers to you. I need to move on, and our next discussion is work group direction and priorities. And Scott Shogun, you have the floor.
Very good. Good morning, everybody. So I know we're running behind on time here. My segment is really kind of the introduction of two topics that we're going to touch on in meetings later this year. If we go to the next slide. So first, a preview for September, and this is a topic that clearly has been getting much more attention in recent months here. The impact of COVID-19, is far-reaching, and certainly kind of the question of the impact of this pandemic on AV and CAT development and how this could change the trajectory moving forward. There's a lot of dimensions to this. Part of this gets to potentially new use cases that weren't envisioned before. Could automation play a role in actually removing people from harm's way from a social distancing perspective? Related to shared CAVs, are there new challenges that weren't envisioned previously in kind of the ecosystem that was looking to be part of the early use cases of development? Are there going to be long-term changes to how we move, our demands for mobility, all of those different factors looking forward? So certainly even in September, we're going to have more questions than answers, but we look forward to having further discussion later this year on this topic. Next slide, please. So the next topic we wanted to move on to, and this is again really introducing a topic that we're going to open for full discussion in June. And I wanted to start with kind of a reminder on where we left off last year and some of the actions on the CAT policy goals that were put forward by the Infrastructure and Systems Subcommittee. So this was a policy framework that was developed by the subcommittee over the course of 2019 with extensive feedback from a large group of stakeholders involved in the committee and recommendations made to the executive committee to adopt the 8 policy goals that were developed by the subcommittee and also to encourage development of a statewide CAT policy framework that encompasses input from all of the other subcommittees as well. And those recommendations were endorsed by both the Executive Committee and the Transportation Commission late last year. Next slide. So just briefly, I'm not going to read all of these, but just to kind of reorient you, again, there were 8 policy goals that were developed through this, and they included organizing for innovation, so kind of the broad brush the structure to meet this technology, encouraging and incentivizing shared mobility, economic vitality and livability, so really creating resilient networks to encourage both of those. Infrastructure and context-sensitive street design. Next slide, please. So additional goals around land use and encouraging land use development patterns to support multimodal connectivity, around equity of access for automation and this new technology. Certainly safety is a key policy goal there, as well as reducing environmental impacts around this technology. Next slide. So the Infrastructure and Systems Subcommittee held a workshop in early April. They've really been diving deeper on these policy goals to identify kind of gaps in current activities, developing draft strategies and action items for each of the goals. And these are not just intended to be led by this subcommittee, but more broadly the stakeholder group. So moving on to the next slide. What we wanted to really present forward here today for thought and for further discussion in June is kind of the concept of, because this policy framework was adopted by the executive committee, is this the right lens through which to view kind of the work group activities, to look at the activities being undertaken by all of the subcommittees and say how do they align with these policy goals? Where are there gaps in activities that are needed to achieve the policy goals? And also potentially to identify goals that are missing to align with some of the existing subcommittee actions. So again, similarly to that, the recommendation that was made to consider developing a broader policy framework that encompasses all the subcommittees. Is this a way to look at where are there missing goals that don't well align with some of the activities being undertaken already? So on the next slide, we took a very simple cut at kind of testing the alignment of the activities that have really been undertaken and spoken on or recommended to date, and kind of looking at how these line up. And as you can see, we're touching a lot of these different areas, and certainly, as I mentioned, the Infrastructure and Systems Subcommittee, through the actions last month, have really identified out action items that pertain to all of these policy areas. But there are certainly gap areas and opportunities for potentially some additional activities to be undertaken to kind of align with a lot of these policy goals that have been laid out here. Next slide, please. So the question on the table, again, for discussion, we certainly don't have time to do this justice today, but for discussion in June is to the executive committee is really, is this the right framework to consider the work group initiatives and gaps? Is that the intent in adopting these policy goals? So really use that as a filter to kind of look at what should the work group be undertaking? Is the intent that every policy goal adopted be addressed through this work group in some way? And is this also the right framework to help identify what additional policy goals should be added to the overall work group framework, or the overall framework at a work group level, to reflect actions from all of the other subcommittees? Essentially, can this be a tool for providing some direction to the subcommittees on areas to focus of agreed importance to the overall work group via the executive committee? So again, we're looking to have further discussion on this at the June 24th executive committee meeting. We wanted to really kind of tee up this concept and leave you all thinking about this as we look to move forward. And then following up on that discussion, the idea we can look even in September as to whether are there some key topics that come out of that discussion that may be good to have addressed as part of our September meeting, as well as kind of updating our overall roadmap for the work group going forward, kind of based on the direction that comes out of this discussion. So again, sneak preview of more discussion in June. And with that, I will turn it back to Commissioner Restucci. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Is there any questions from the exec committee at this time on this item? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Oh, hold on, maybe. Nope, I think we're good. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the exec committee members' items, 11 o'clock. Do any exec committee members have items that they wish to discuss at this time? If so, please enter your item in the question box and we'll get to you. Okay, I see Exec Committee or Brian Mitzel would like to speak. Brian, you should be unmuted by now.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is Brian Mitzel, myself, and Tom Alberg, as I think most of you know, chair of the Autonomous Vehicle ACES Forum, Autonomous Connected Electric and Shared Vehicle Group. Looking at the presentations over the last couple of meetings, I'd love to recommend that the committee would benefit from panel presentations from folks in the private sector space working on these technologies. I think the PACCAR testing facility tour was very useful, I think, in terms of opening folks' eyes to some of the testing that's going on. But I think it'd be very useful to get presentations from some OEMs and technology platform providers that are actually doing testing on the roads, as well as presentations in certainly the 5G fiber broadband space as we think about infrastructure, and folks doing work around employee shuttles, rideshare companies, and things like that. So my recommendation would be and ask if we could have put together some private, like I said, panel presentations to update folks on technology. And as we think about legislative or regulatory options, getting a survey of what states are doing are useful, but it also be, I think, useful to have private sector companies talk about how they're dealing with the regulations, what's working, what's not, as a perspective as well. So I'd put that out there for consideration.
Thank you, Brian. Other questions or comments? Other items from committee members?
Jim, this is Rima.
Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to respond to Brian's great suggestion, and if the group is comfortable with this suggestion, we will work with Brian and Tom and Bruce Agnew, and of course you, Jim, to try to develop some panel presentations for some of the meetings coming up the rest of this year and into the future. So if anyone has any comments or concerns with that, please feel free to shoot me an email or call me if you don't want to discuss it now, and we'll kind of roll forward on that to try to develop that further.
Rima, there was a question in regards to whether or not this particular meeting will be made available, the entire recording.
Yeah, we are recording it, and I believe, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, we plan to post it on the website.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from the exec committee members? Anything else for the good of the order? Okay, I have nothing else. Just want to thank everyone for participating today. I apologize for some of the technical difficulties. We will get them ironed out as we move forward. Rima has my contact information, and any exec committee member that wants to talk to me directly can contact me. Rima, do you have anything else to add? Scott or anyone else?
Hey, Jim, I'm sorry to jump in here. We did have a question come in from Charles Knutson.
I see that from Charles. Charles, please go ahead.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Jim, and appreciated the presentations today. And I thought it would be really helpful in this September conversation that Scott had brought up to think more about how autonomous vehicles can have a broader use while we're in the pandemic and this sort of post-COVID-19 world. And you may have seen that there's some AV shuttles that are transporting COVID-19 tests to the Mayo Clinic. Those are Navia shuttles, I believe, in Florida. And I'm starting to see more of these kind of examples in other parts of the world. And I think a presentation on those broader uses, the list that Scott provided there, but also maybe thinking about as we're moving into contact tracing, if someone has COVID-like symptoms, how will they, if they show up to work and they've got a fever, how will they have some sort of transportation to get back to isolation? There's questions like that we're wrestling with in live time. And I think these are going to be ongoing questions going forward, and be fruitful to have this conversation with the group.
Thank you, Charles. I appreciate that comment. Any other questions or comments from the committee? Okay, I know of no other business to come before this august body, and would adjourn the meeting if there's no objection. Seeing no objection, so ordered. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.